We have breaking news. On April 30, 1975, the communist Northern Vietnam officially conquered the southern Vietnamese capital, Saigon. The city has now been renamed the Ho Chi Minh City.
This is a crushing defeat for our containment of communism. Another country falls victim to the ideologies of the Soviet Union and all its allies.
This officially marks the end of the Vietnam War. How did our country go from saying hundreds of thousands of our young men to fight this war into ultimately losing this battle against communism?
Your anchors,
Trent Huynh
and Ethan Pham will recount the events that led to this loss that will undoubtedly go down in American history.
Our segment starts off with the inauguration of President Nixon on January 20, 1969. Our country had already sent 500,000 men to fight Vietnam. His election was based in part on his promise to end the Vietnam War. Now, did he really do this?
President Nixon started the process of Vietnamization, where the government gradually started to withdraw soldiers from Vietnam while sending resources to the Southern Vietnamese army. Nixon had started this process in an attempt to appease anti-war sentiment while maintaining his support for the Southern Vietnamese.
President Nixon had addressed the nation through the Great Silent Majority speech on November 3rd, 1969. The anti-war protesters were very vocal about their distaste for the war and how they wanted that war to end as soon as possible. Here are live reactions to the Great Silent Majority speech. There's so much commotion outside protests against Vietnamization because they want the war to be over right now. However, I support Vietnamization. I'm just too scared to speak about it. Nixon has just released a speech addressing the nation. I better go watch it right now.
So tonight, to you, the great silent majority of my fellow Americans, I ask for your support.
President Nixon asked for my support. I better go write him a letter, or even better, talk to his anti-war protesters.
What? Nixon wants to continue the war in Vietnam? I'm gonna protest harder. I'm gonna make even more signs. End the war now. End the war now.
Hey you! Stop! Vietnamization is a good thing. We need to continue to fight against communism.
No, Vietnamization is bad. We need to stop losing our troops.
The speech deepened the divide between the two sides of the U.S. public regarding the Vietnam War. The support Nixon received gave him the confidence that he was approaching the war the correct way. But it might have not been completely true. For Vietnamization to succeed, Nixon wanted to strengthen South Vietnam by weakening North Vietnam. In the interest of Vietnamization, Nixon used his newfound support from the Great Silent Majority to bolster his support for his Vietnam War strategy, which included the bombing of the Ho Chi Minh Trail in Cambodia. Operation Menu was a codename for these targeted bombings. This decision further escalated the war and resulted in many Cambodian civilian casualties.
The American public saw Operation Menu as contradictory to the policy of Vietnamization, as it directly attacked North Vietnamese forces rather than just supporting South Vietnamese. In response to attacks on Cambodia, student demonstrators at Kent State University organized a protest against the war. The protesters had burned down the Reserve Office Training Corps building on campus.
These protests escalated into the students throwing rocks at the Ohio National Guard stationed there. In a tragic turn, the National Guard began firing on the crowd. 4 students were killed, with 9 others being injured.
The Kent State Massacre of May 4, 1970 came with many ramifications. To Americans, what type of government would fire on young unarmed protesters?
Many students were outraged, and colleges had to close down due to unrest. However, war-supporting Americans had support for the National Guard.
President Nixon expressed sympathy and had called instant tragedy. However, his response to the issue was controversial. He had blamed the radical anti-war protesters for his unrest, while never directly criticizing the National Guard.
Nevertheless, the massacre massively increased anti-war sentiment. A distrust in the government sparked from the incident. The war, however, was rapidly going in the North's favor due to the loss of direct U.S. military personnel. On January 20th, 1973, Nixon had signed the Paris Peace Accords.
This document officially ended all U.S. combat involvement in Vietnam. All troops were withdrawn in Vietnam, and U.S. bases were dismantled. In return, the Northern Vietnamese Army would release the U.S. prisoners of war. A ceasefire was called. These documents aimed to restore peace in Vietnam. Unfortunately, North and South Vietnam began fighting almost immediately after signing these accords. The South Vietnamese Army began to weaken massively without U.S. assistance.
Nixon would not finish his presidential term by the end of the Vietnam War. Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein had connected President Nixon to the break-in of the Watergate Hotel on June 17, 1972. This domestic issue further distracted the U.S. from the Vietnam War.
Due to the citizens' mistrust in Nixon, the president formally signed on August 8, 1974. He is the first in United States history to do so.
Minutes after Nixon had formally resigned, his vice president, Gerald Ford, was sworn into office.
President Ford's ideals were to continue financial aid to the war. However, without support from Congress, Ford focused on humanitarian efforts to save as many lives as possible. On April 29, 1975, at approximately 10:51 a.m., the American radio station began playing White Christmas as a signal to start Operation Frequent Wind, the emergency evacuation of Saigon. Chaos ensued as the extraction of the last few thousand American soldiers and many Southern Vietnamese allies rushed to escape the city.
Operation Frequent Wind aired into the early hours of April 30th, 1975. By early afternoon, North Vietnamese forces have occupied important parts of Saigon and raised their flag over the South Vietnamese presidential palace, officially marking the fall of Saigon and the reason for your breaking news tonight.
Thank you for listening to our broadcast.